Our next speaker is Russ Soyring. He is retired, like many of the people in this room, but he was the planning director for the city of Traverse City for how many years?
35.
35 years, and generally just joined the ranks of the active in different ways people like myself. So go ahead, Russ, and talk about it.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's like the fourth quarter, and the home team's ahead 31-0, so some of the fans have left and everything. You've heard some pretty high-level thinking and very thoughtful thinking, and my comments are going to be a little more pedestrian, but I'm speaking about walkable hamlet, so it's only appropriate. So I'm taking this, I've been a city planner, so I've learned a lot today. I've learned really the challenges of villages and small towns that don't have the infrastructure like Traverse City has, where we already have the municipal services of water and sewer and a bunch of other staff to kind of help out. So I can see it being an entirely different type of realm that we're working in here, and I think it's a good learning experience for me as well. So I've learned a lot from this day-long presentation. So one of the treats that I have is I have a very short presentation, so you'll be happy about that. But anyway, one of the things that has inspired what I'm going to be talking about is a book that there were 4 communities that helped the Michigan Municipal League and the Congress for the New Urbanism developed a booklet. It's called Enabling Better Places, User's Guide to Zoning Reform. And I would recommend you get it. There's the line how you can get it on site, on the computer, and it's full of just practical, thoughtful ideas how to improve your zoning code in your communities to build a more walkable, more compact type of community. So I would highly recommend it. It's an easy read. I think it's one of the best documents I have ever seen. It really is going to help, especially if you need to explain it to planning commissioners and the general public of what you're trying to achieve. There's a lot we could talk about in building a walkable type of community. We could spend 2 days. I'm only going to spend maybe 15 minutes the most. And I'm going to focus on step 1, some of the small changes that we can do with parking, frontages, and signs in the public realm, the streets and the sidewalks. So one of the things I do believe in is that we should always make incremental steps. And I always kind of try to press my planning commission that I was working is that let's do something, even if it's a small step in the direction that we want to go. It may not be exactly what we want to do over, in our ideal type of vision of what our community will look like, but at least take the step in the direction that you want to go. And that's really what I think making these incremental changes is a very effective tool, and we should not underestimate the power and the significance of making those small steps. Sometimes when we do try to do the overall, and you take like a typical zoning ordinance and you try to change it to like a form-based code, that's like going from speaking English to Italian, and people just don't understand it. They're fearful of it. They are comfortable with their existing rules. And so even when I try to do it in Traverse City, we got a lot of resistance. And so one of the things that we did do is that we just made those incremental changes to our existing zoning code. So one of the first things as a planner, of course, you want to look at your master plan and make sure that some of the changes that I'm going to be talking about would be supported by your township plan or your village plan. If it's not, then you need to really obviously revisit your master plan, because you're going to want to have the support, and you don't want to have the legal challenges later on because your master plan is not supporting of these type of changes. So it's important to look at your master plan, and if it's in good shape by saying that it already supports walkability, compact uses, mixed uses, I think you're pretty well set with the things that I'm going to be talking about. So one of the key things, and Adam talked a little bit about this with the pattern and everything, is what is incredibly important is that when we lay out our streets, that we think about building short blocks and narrow streets. If you go to Portland, Oregon, their blocks are 200 feet by 200 feet. In Traverse City, our blocks are 600 feet by 330 feet. much bigger blocks. And so the more blocks you have, the more intersections you have, the better the traffic will flow. You won't have nearly as many congestion. You have, as Jane Jacobs described in her books, you'll have many opportunities to make many different routes on your daily activities, which makes life more interesting than taking the same route at the same time. If you have very few blocks and very few intersections, then those collector streets and those arterial streets will get overloaded, and then you have traffic jams. If you ever go on South Airport Road in Traverse City, there's very few alternatives. If there's a traffic crash or there's some type of incident, you're just going to be stuck in a linear parking lot for about an hour or two. But if that happens in Traverse City, you have many. We've actually closed down 3 or 4 bridges right now, and we still are able to get around. Not as easy, but we still have alternatives to get around. And one of the things I learned from these from Australian planners is the walkability index is based on the density of intersections. So look at all those orange dots, and that gives you opportunities to take different routes to get around. And it also helps to diffuse the traffic so it's not all going down certain streets. Of course, sidewalks are important with our older population that we have in this village and also in a lot of our communities in Northwest Lower Michigan. People need benches. I have a friend who says, I can walk anywhere forever if I have a bench about every quarter mile. So recently she was visiting me, and we actually carried a little milk carton container around so she could sit down because we didn't have benches where we were walking. So, and then another thing that's really important is on-street parking. And we have on-street parking right outside the township hall, or the village hall here. And that really helps in a number of ways. It actually creates that armor barrier, so as you're walking down the sidewalk, you feel very well protected on that sidewalk. And it also helps reduce the need for off-street parking and parking lots. And anytime you had a parking lot, of course, off-street, you had a driveway in, and that creates a conflict point for pedestrians. So little villages like Empire can probably get by pretty much simply by having on-street parking. And so when we design streets, we really should design them adequate width so we have parallel parking on one or both sides, potentially diagonal parking. Of course, another thing that is pretty important to make walkability more interesting is to put the buildings close by. Why do we want to put the buildings close by? Well, first of all, it gives this sense of enclosure to give a very comfortable space in the downtown area of your community. There's a sense of protection when you have buildings that are closer by than if you're walking down a street. I'm going to use South Airport Road again. If you walk along there, it's very hostile to the traffic. The buildings are set far back. There's parking lots in the front. You feel like you're kind of lost in a large expanse, like you feel pretty small, like you're a small boat in the big ocean. Very vulnerable. But if you start creating these enclosed spaces, there's a comfort level that comes with it as well. But if you want to get people to walk, they have to be entertained. And Disney knows very well that you'll spend $120 a day to walk around Disney because you're being entertained, because they have so much activity along all those street edges. And the same thing is like you're in Sutton's Bay in that lower picture. That is, what makes this interesting is that you can go by storefronts, you can look into the windows, and you can be entertained as you go along. Americans don't want to walk very far, but if they're entertained, they'll walk maybe more than a quarter mile. So if we can make our streets more and more interesting, Americans will walk, like Germans and how people around the world, they'll walk longer distances. And so it's critically important that we entertain people along our street edges. I mentioned this earlier that every time you put a driveway in, you eliminate one or more parking spaces, public parking spaces on the street. There should be a cost consequence for that. So if a developer wants to put a driveway in, they should actually have to pay the community for taking 1 to 2 to 3 parking spaces off the street, because there's a real cost consideration of what is lost for the public, especially when they say private parking and nobody else can use that parking lot. There's a consequence there. But there also is a conflict, as was mentioned earlier. You might have cars backing up over the sidewalk, or you're going to have people turning and not see the pedestrian. So every time you have a driveway, you have a conflict point, it becomes another deterrent for walking. So try not to have any driveways. Try to use alleys if you can and service the parking lots off the alleys. And again, utilize on-street parking whenever possible. And of course, this is right outside, not too far from here. Public sidewalks should never break for the private driveway. It's giving, like, the car has precedence over the pedestrian. The pedestrian should be given top priority. The car should be secondary. And the sidewalk will help to indicate, a sidewalk that goes through the driveway will help to identify to the motorists that they could interact with the pedestrian. But if you don't have a sidewalk through there, it makes it look like the pedestrian is second class, and a motorist may not even think about looking and yielding to a pedestrian. I mentioned a little bit earlier about entertaining. We have in Traverse City transparent requirements. They range from around 50% in most of our downtown area. Transparent, having windows and having doors that face the street is really important. It shows activity, animation. As you're walking, you can peer into see what type of goods are in the store. You might see somebody that you know in a coffee shop or in a restaurant, stop in. And so it just makes it much more entertaining. It's also real important that as you're walking outside, and just say you slip and fall, someone in the store can see that you have slipped and fell. And so there's a safety aspect to it. The upper story windows are really important too, because the person that may not be a shady person coming in and is maybe doing no good for the community, and someone could report that activity. So there's kind of eyes in the street, and that makes it for a safer street as well. The safer the street, the more comfortable you are, the more likely that you're going to walk in your community. Another thing, I'm not a really big shopper, and I always ask my wife where this store is in downtown Traverse City. She knows them, she has them all memorized, but I just don't remember where these stores are. But if you have these projecting signs or these flag type of signs, they will help pedestrians as they walk down the sidewalk. And those are just a kind of a subtle little change that really can be a pedestrian-oriented type of sign versus a sign that's just on the wall of the building is more for a motorist that's further away out in the street. But when you're walking down the sidewalk to help to identify where different businesses are located, these types of signs are very attractive. So this is something you might want to think about in your sign ordinance. Make sure that you do allow for those to occur. Another thing I think is really important, this is getting outside of your village commercial core area, will be allowing for porches, and that was mentioned earlier. Who mentioned that? Was it?
I did.
Robert, you mentioned it. I think it's a very important thing. When I first came to Traverse City, we were sending people to the Zoning Board of Appeals to put a porch in, making it really difficult. They basically had to say, they had to prove that they had a hardship to build a porch in the front. I said, why don't we rework that? And what we did is we said, you can extend your porch 10 feet in front of your house, but no closer than 6 feet to the sidewalk. And that allowed, we had unbelievable new porches that were built in Traverse City. I think it builds a much friendlier community. We had this music fest that just happened recently in the neighborhood where I live, and people can interact. It's a very safe place. With COVID, it's been great to have people on your porches, but it also allows for neighbors to get to know neighbors. And once neighbors get to know neighbors, again, you feel more comfortable, and I think, and you feel safer in your neighborhood, more likely you're going to walk. And it's a little more entertaining when you walk, and instead of looking at garage doors, you're looking at front porches. There's more likely you're going to see people, and people are the most, of anything, humans love to look at other humans. They find that to be the most entertaining. They like to make up stories what they're doing. So, probably the biggest thing that we can do to build a more walkable community is talk about parking. And as a planner, I probably talked about parking 90% of my working hours, we used to kind of joke how long it was going to take before somebody mentions parking in the beginning of the day. It's usually the first 15 minutes of the day, someone will start talking about, we need to talk about parking. And as much as I don't like to talk about parking, it's critical that we do talk about it. One is I would recommend for all communities to eliminate minimum parking requirements. They simply aren't needed. The bankers are going to require parking, the developers are going to require parking, the people that move into the buildings are going to require parking, franchises are going to be requiring parking, excessive parking. So I don't think it's important. What we do need to do is have some parking maximums, because if you look at communities all around Michigan, all around the United States, we have a lot of empty parking lots. And we have a lot of land that's really wasted. And if you have to walk along a street that has, let's say, 50% of the street edge is a parking lot, it's not going to be very entertaining, and you're not going to have that walkability. You're also going to be separating uses further and further apart. We need to make cities to be compact and convenient, and having all that surface parking is going to make it less convenient, make parking less convenient. So again, incorporate on-street parking. Anytime you can, put the parking behind the building. Don't allow it to be in the front of the building. Oops, wrong. Uh-oh.
So if you have parking behind the building, then you need alleys.
Alleys are really special, and the fact that Robert had the vision to put alleys in is remarkable. There's a little development called Seaside, Florida, which Andres Giovanni helped develop. And I went down and listened to him at a seminar down there, and I said, what would be one thing you do different? He says, I would have built alleys, because along their streets are all these driveways. And so the new town, the new neighborhood, I think has one up on Seaside, which is world famous new urbanist community in the United States here. So one of the advantages of some of the things we're talking about is, and this has come up with the dollar store, or the Dollar General in this case. This is an image that I just came back from the Upper Peninsula, and I thought, well, I heard that I might be speaking here, so I started snapping pictures on my way home. My wife was wondering why it was taking me so long to get home, but I was snapping pictures partly for this presentation. And so when you come into Curtis, there's a Welcome to Curtis sign, and across the street is this very generic Dollar General. There is a car parked in there, if you notice. And I'm along the street here, so some of the things, if you write these things in your code, it's just going to make Dollar Generals and all those other type of franchises maybe a little more reluctant to come to your town. If you don't allow parking in the front yard, if you have transparency requirements that are at least 50%, and you put a maximum on a parking that is allowed, they're going to say, I don't want to be in your community, or they're going to try to get a variance before your zoning board of appeals, and they may be successful if they really want to be there, but at least you should make it difficult, because this doesn't add any character to any village or any hamlet in Michigan. I think it's a real distraction.
Question?
Yeah. What? Oh, yes.
Well, as far as keeping Dollar General, my idea was all dollar stores can go into general industrial district. You have them in there, and they won't be able to beat that, and they'll have to go next to the industrial district where they don't want to be.
Well, they are retail, so if you allow retail in zoning, they're going to go where the retail's allowed. But if you have these form-based type of standards that you can easily incorporate in the existing codes, relatively easy, if your master plan supports it, I think you can make it difficult for them to build. If you look at the CVS store in Traverse City at Front and Division, we required that storefront to be brought up in the front, and even though it has, and we have required the door to face Front Street, but there's other locations when that store fails, we're trying to think, what could be the new life for that store? So there's other places for new storefronts, other doors, so that could be broken up to like 4 little stores. And we wanted that, they didn't want to do any of that stuff. And I said, well, you need a rezoning, and you're not going to get that rezoning unless you make some of these changes. And so basically it was done to a conditional rezoning. So that's another tool that you can use in Michigan to make sure that it meets the requirements of your community. So I get a lot of pushback like, oh, we really need more parking all the time. So what I tell people, just go on Google Earth, look at your community. This is in Sutton's Bay. When you have all this asphalt sitting mostly vacant, it really hurts walkability. The ability to be compact and walkable and have street edges that are entertaining simply is not possible if you force people to have parking. So it's really critically important. Eliminate the parking requirements. It's not necessary. Put the maximums in there. There will always be a desire to put the parking in anyway, so just make sure that you have an ordinance that says it will be parked in the rear. If you have to, say maybe on the side of the store, but make sure that then it has some type of landscape barrier, architectural wall, so you can kind of hide the parking. So the street edge, you don't kind of lose and you don't have that missing tooth look in a kind of a dead zone as you're walking down your street edge. Some people say, well, this wasn't a very busy day, but you can go back and sometimes you can see various years of these scenes, and you can still see empty parking lots all the time. The last set of flights that we did in Traverse City, of course, the pandemic has been going on, and all our parking lots are empty. So it's not a really good time to show those, but we have 50% of downtown Traverse City is just asphalt parking lots. So one of the things that I also would encourage, and that you can give incentives for this, is to have shared parking that you can reduce setbacks, and you can maybe reduce parking requirements for some of the shared parking because they have so many benefits. One is that when you share parking, those shared parking lots tend to be more full more often, and you get some more efficiencies because if everybody has their own parking lot, especially if they limit the ability to park there because they parking for my customers only, then those things sit empty. Like a doctor's office might be closed on the weekends. All weekend long, those parking lots are sitting empty. That's a really waste of resources. Land resources are very precious, and we really can't afford to do that. So if you can make your parking lots more efficiently used by sharing those, you'll get some efficiencies. Various uses have different times when they peak. Office building is going to be busy during the day. The bars and restaurants are going to be more busy during the evening, so they work really well together. And of course, if you share parking and you have more efficient parking, maybe you have less driveways, so you might have less conflict points. So I'm not going to go all through this to save some time, but those are the kind of the summary of my comments. I guess I'll just summarize by saying this. It's really pretty easy to make some incremental changes to your zoning code to make your community more walkable. And you can do that by just making some small steps. I would do the things that are very easy, less controversial. I'll just talk about parking just a second. Downtown Traverse City has no parking requirements. Grand Traverse Commons, the old psychiatric hospital, has no minimum parking requirements. We have no parking requirements if you're next to 500 feet of a parking deck or a transit center. And we haven't had any problems with that. So I would highly recommend you look at your parking. It's probably the biggest thing you could possibly do by tweaking your ordinance. So thank you very much. Mark?
Yeah.
What would you think of an incentive for any area that's designated a retail district to incentivize all office space to be on the second floor? You know, monetary incentives or some kind of encouragement, because in Old Town, it's like you got a number of retail stores trying to make it and draw customers down to Old Town, and yet half of the store frontage are legal offices. you know, or insurance offices. It's like-
We considered in Traverse City at least to say that the first floor has to be retail. I studied that around the ordinances around the city, around the country. San Diego is one I remember looking at where they said 75% of your first floor had to be retail because that's really what you want in your town center. You don't really want to have like a builder's office downtown or an accounting office downtown. But I don't know. I don't think I would do that now with, we have a lot of retailers, you know, now being done by the internet. Filling retail spaces is extremely difficult. I think you leave it pretty open that you can have offices on the first floor, retail on the first floor, even residential on the first floor. But design your building so they have the flexibility that they could easily convert to a retail store. I think one thing that we did is in Traverse City, I think that lends itself to retail and restaurants is we said the first floor had to be 14 or 15 feet, depending on what district you are, to make sure that, let's say right now it's this, like right now we have somebody who's a custom builder, downtown Traverse City on Front Street. Last thing we want to have done. But it could easily convert back to a restaurant because it has the tall ceilings. So I think, and has big windows. So all that stuff lends itself nicely to retail market and to restaurants. But if you design a building with small, squatty little windows and you have low ceilings, it's probably never going to be retail. It's never going to be a restaurant. It's probably going to be an office. So design it so it lends itself well to retail.
I was, a couple weeks ago, I was listening to a developer, quite a large developer in Grand Rapids. He said they're having a lot of trouble leasing out their retail space, and it's required in so many places. And one thing they could have put in was a dentist office, which I thought was, you know, pretty close to retail. There's people coming and going all day. And there may be things like that that we'll have to allow in the retail spaces.
Yeah, I think we should let the market dictate goes in, but we should focus on the form of the building that allows for the building to have new life after that original use goes in or the current use goes in, that it can transform into something else relatively easy, versus building a building that is a single purpose building that can only be used for that use, and then it needs to be torn down before you can go in again. That doesn't make any sense to have a building that has such a short life. Yes?
Question about the parking. I completely support your idea of shared parking. But that said, I know of property owners with parking lots who are concerned with their parking areas being taken advantage by people who want long-term parking, and they walk 2 blocks to work in the hospital, as well as the insurance liability issues of having cars who aren't their patrons there and what that might mean. Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, I hear from attorneys all the time that we can't share because that's going to put my client at risk. I think one of the best things you possibly could do is if you can make it in a municipal type of a setting would be the best, where the municipality would take the liability if somebody slips and falls on an icy pavement or something of that order. But yeah, it's a reason why we don't see a lot of sharing of parking right now. It's almost like feeling like, you know, nobody wants to share parking. It's like, I always say that parking is more important than oxygen that we breathe. You know, we have to have parking, and nobody wants to give it up, and nobody wants to share it because we might need it. But there is resistance always to do that. So, what can you do to build some incentives? We do require parking in some areas of town, but we give you a reduction of parking if you do share parking. We allow you to reduce some of your setbacks if you share parking. We put in some impervious surface limits that make it a little harder to just fill your lot with a parking lot. So we're trying to move people a little bit, you know, like share because you'll be getting some benefits, but often we don't have cooperation because of what you brought up. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.